In 2013, Japan made a promise it could never keep. With a single signature, its central bank decided it would print unlimited money until inflation appeared. There was no deadline. There was no exit plan. At first, nothing broke. The skyscrapers of Shinjuku remained upright, and the trains continued their rhythmic, punctual glide across the Kanto plain. But beneath this surface of mechanical perfection, the fundamental nature of the Japanese state had changed. Once a government realizes its central bank will buy every bond it issues, stopping becomes impossible. This wasn't stimulus, it was addiction. The policy was framed as a bazooka, an overwhelming force of liquidity designed to blow the doors off a 2-decade stagnation. The mainstream economic data point was staggering. The Bank of Japan committed to purchasing government bonds at a pace of roughly 60 to 70 trillion yen per year. By doing so, the bank effectively became the shadow financier of the national budget. No tanks rolled in, no bombs fell, just numbers on paper. Yet, these numbers represented a transfer of power from the market to the printing press. The price of debt was no longer determined by risk or reality, but by the sheer will of Governor Kuroda's pen. An insider detail that often escapes the history books was the subtle shift in the bank's internal collateral rules. To keep the machine running, the bank had to expand the types of assets it was willing to swallow, eventually moving into equity ETFs and corporate debt. They weren't just fixing the interest rate, they were becoming the owner of the economy itself. This created a perverse incentive for the Ministry of Finance. When the cost of borrowing is suppressed by your own central bank, the concept of a budget deficit loses its sting. Discipline didn't just fade, it became an obstacle to the new status quo. The silence of this transition was its most lethal feature. Most economic collapses are loud, marked by bank runs or crashing stock tickers. But Japan's descent was quiet, cushioned by the very yen being printed to hide the pain. The nation had entered a state of perpetual life support, where the medicine was indistinguishable from the disease. Economists still argue whether this was incompetence or something worse. Some suggest it was a calculated attempt to inflate away the debt, a gamble that assumed the bank could simply turn off the tap once the target was met. They failed to realize that you cannot turn off a tap when the entire house has been plumbed to rely on the flood. The trap was set, not with a snap, but with the soft rustle of a bond being moved from one ledger to another. For a while, it felt like success. The numbers on the screens in the Tokyo Stock Exchange began to climb, reaching heights that had been unthinkable since the bubble burst in 1989. Exports improved as the yen softened, and the global headlines celebrated a great Japanese comeback. It was a period of high-gloss optimism. But inside the halls of government, a dangerous belief was taking root, more intoxicating than any market rally, the belief that this never had to stop. The mainstream economic reality was that the Bank of Japan had become the dominant force in the bond market, gobbling up 60 to 70 trillion yen of government debt every single year. These weren't short-term fixes or temporary bridges. They were 30-year promises, long-dated obligations that the bank was pulling onto its balance sheet like a black hole devouring light. This fundamental shift meant that Japan no longer needed real, private buyers for its debt. The traditional bond vigilantes, the investors who punish reckless governments by demanding higher interest, had been silenced. If the government spent more, the bank simply paid. A lesser-known side effect of this arrangement was the total erosion of political accountability. An insider detail from the Ministry of Finance suggests that during this era, the rigorous debate over how to pay for new policies vanished. When spending becomes painless, discipline disappears. The government began to fund massive social programs and infrastructure projects not through tax revenue or efficiency, but through the issuance of new debt that they knew would be immediately purchased by their own central bank. It was a circular economy of paper, a closed loop where the state was effectively writing checks to itself. The success was a mirage, a temporary high provided by the very addiction that was hollowing out the nation's future. The stock market was rising not because of increased productivity or innovation, but because it was being floated on a rising tide of printed currency. The recovery was decoupled from the actual health of the economy. Economists still argue whether this was incompetence or something worse. It appeared to be a grand experiment in modern monetary theory, testing whether a nation could truly print its way to prosperity without a reckoning. But as the bank's balance sheet grew to exceed the size of the entire national GDP, the painless phase began to sour. The more the government relied on the bank, the less it could ever hope to survive without it. They had traded their fiscal sovereignty for a decade of quiet headlines and rising indices. The ghost of the 2013 decision was no longer just a policy. It was the only thing keeping the lights on in Tokyo. The mirage was beautiful, but the desert was still there, waiting at the edge of the frame. This is the moment Japan lost control. As the central bank absorbed more and more debt, something irreversible happened to the nation's financial DNA. The bazooka had fired so many rounds that the smoke now obscured the exit. The mainstream economic data point that defined this era was the implementation of yield curve control, a policy where the bank didn't just buy bonds, but explicitly promised to keep the 10-year interest rate at nearly 0%. It was a declaration of war against the market's natural gravity. The system became trapped by its own survival. Interest rates could no longer rise, not even by a fraction of a percent. The mathematics were as cold as they were terrifying. With a debt load surpassing 250% of GDP, even a minor increase in the cost of borrowing would cause government interest costs to explode. The national budget would be cannibalized just to pay interest on the interest. If rates normalized, pension systems that were heavily invested in these safe bonds would face a catastrophic loss of value, and commercial banks would find their balance sheets riddled with holes. Japan didn't choose this prison. It built it one bond at a time. An insider detail of this lock-in was the psychological shift within the Bank of Japan's trading floor. The market for Japanese government bonds, JGBs, effectively ceased to exist. On some days, zero trades occurred. The central bank had become the market, the buyer, and the regulator all at once. Internal memos from private Japanese banks at the time began to warn of systemic fragility, noting that they were no longer functioning as lenders, but as warehouses for the central bank's liquidity. They were forced to hold cash that they couldn't lend profitably, while the central bank charged them for the privilege. Every option left made things worse. If the bank stopped buying bonds to curb inflation, the government would go insolvent. If they continued buying, the yen would lose its value against the rest of the world. Economists still argue whether this was incompetence or something worse. It appeared to be a state of financial repression, where the government was intentionally keeping rates below inflation to slowly erode the real value of its debt. But in doing so, they had sacrificed the market's ability to signal danger. The alarm bells had been muted by the central bank's intervention, leaving the nation to drift toward a waterfall in total silence. The point of no return had been crossed not with a crash, but with the steady, relentless hum of a printing press that could no longer be turned off. Once markets understood the Bank of Japan would never stop buying, price discovery died. In a healthy economy, prices act as a signal, a way for the system to tell the difference between a productive company and a failing one. But by pinning interest rates to the floor and flooding the market with yen, the central bank effectively turned off the lights. Bonds no longer reflected risk. Stocks floated without gravity, propelled upwards not by earnings, but by the sheer volume of cash looking for a place to hide. The economy began to rot quietly. This wasn't the dramatic explosion of a market crash, but a slow, creeping stagnation. The mainstream economic data point of this era was the rise of the zombie company. These were firms that were functionally insolvent, unable to cover their interest payments from their actual profits, yet kept alive by the grace of near-zero interest rates and endless bank rollovers. By 2020, it was estimated that 1 in 10 Japanese companies was a zombie. Because these failing firms were never allowed to go bankrupt, they tied up capital, labor, and resources that should have flowed to new, innovative startups. Productivity stalled, and growth slowed to a crawl. An insider detail of this decay could be found in the ETF purchase program. The Bank of Japan wasn't just buying government debt, it eventually became the largest shareholder in the Japanese stock market. This led to a surreal corporate landscape where CEOs no longer worried about pleasing private investors or improving efficiency. Why bother with the hard work of innovation when the central bank was a guaranteed buyer of your stock, regardless of your performance? This created a moral hazard of national proportions. The incentive to compete was replaced by the incentive to survive within the protective bubble of the bank's balance sheet. The cost was not paid by politicians or the architects of the 2013 plan. It was paid by the savers, the retirees, watching their purchasing power erode as the yen's value began to fray at the edges. It was paid by the workers trapped in low-wage stability, their salaries frozen in a world where the cost of living was being pushed up by imported inflation. Economists still argue whether this was incompetence or something worse. Some call it a lost decade that never truly ended, a state where the appearance of stability was maintained by sacrificing the dynamism of the future. The nation wasn't collapsing, it was simply settling into a permanent, comfortable decline, where trust in the value of money began to disappear as slowly as the setting sun. Why not just stop printing? It is the question that haunts every boardroom, from Marunouchi to Wall Street. The answer is as simple as it is terrifying, because stopping would be worse than continuing. To raise rates now would be to pull the plug on a patient whose entire circulatory system has been replaced by the machine. If the Bank of Japan allows interest rates to normalize, the government collapses under the weight of its own debt service, and the zombie corporations that make up the backbone of the employment sector would vanish overnight. Every exit destroys something vital. So, Japan chose the only path left: delay, manage, and pretend stability is health. Japan was not reckless. It was logical. The architects of the 2013 decision followed the path of least resistance at every turn, choosing the immediate comfort of the printing press over the structural pain of reform. And that is what makes this a global warning. The same logic that debt can be managed forever if interest rates are suppressed now guides central banks across the Western world. When debt becomes unpayable, printing becomes policy. When money loses its limits, nations lose their freedom to choose a different future. Japan is simply the first to reach the end of the road. The mainstream economic reality is that Japan has become a liquidity trap of unprecedented proportions. Despite the trillions of yen injected into the system, the velocity of money remains stagnant. The young generations are inheriting a mountain of debt they never voted for, while the elderly cling to a currency that buys less with every passing year. Confidence has not vanished in a sudden panic, it has leaked out through 1,000 small holes. And once trust in the fundamental value of money fades, it never fully returns. Economists still argue whether this was incompetence or something worse. Some view it as a managed decline, a way to shrink a nation's ambitions without triggering a revolution. Others see it as a mathematical prison from which there is no escape. Japan is still standing, but it is no longer moving. It is a nation trapped between collapse and continuation, a chilling preview of what happens when a society decides that the present is worth more than the future. There was no explosion, no panic, no single day that history will remember as the Great Crash. There was just a decision, a signature, and a promise that could never be undone. The story of Japan's interest rate trap is not a story of failure, but a story of a system that worked exactly as it was designed to until it became the only thing left. The lights of Tokyo are still bright, but they are powered by the embers of a dying currency. The trap is closed, the gears are locked, and the world is watching, realizing too late that they are standing in the same room.